welcome to This Explainer. Okay, so when you think of the 1950s, you probably picture a pristine suburban lawn, right? A shiny new Chevrolet parked in the driveway, the perfectly content nuclear family. But what if I told you that underneath all that glossy veneer of Tupperware parties and sock hops, a completely different reality was simmering? Today, we're going to peel back the wallpaper on one of the most misunderstood decades in American history. I'm literally so excited to guide you through this, because the story we usually hear about this era, it's really only half the picture.
Before we really get rolling, I want you to keep a fundamental question in the back of your mind. Was the 1950s a true golden age of limitless American optimism, or was it an era of deep, suffocating paranoia? Keep chewing on that as we go, because we're going to challenge pretty much everything you think you know about poodle skirts, perfect suburbs, and the post-war boom.
All right, here's our roadmap for today. We're looking at the Affluent Society, Designing Suburban America, the Red Scare, Voices of Dissent, and finally, the Seeds of the 60s.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the Affluent Society, an era of unprecedented prosperity.
So let's start with the surface level. It was undeniably an era of absolute economic miracles. Coming right out of World War II, the American economy performed at levels that completely blew away the lingering shadows of the Great Depression. We're talking about a gross domestic product growing by roughly 3.5% every single year, straight through the decade. Now, what does that actually mean for the average person? Well, it was revolutionary. Suddenly you had refrigerators, washing machines, and actual measurable leisure time just becoming the norm. Americans basically mastered the mass production of private goods, sparking this massive wave of middle-class prosperity. It's exactly what economist John Kenneth Galbraith famously dubbed the Affluent Society. And the human side of that incredible economic boom? Well, it was a massive demographic explosion. Get this, over 4 million babies were born in the single peak year of 1957 alone. 4 million! That is just a staggering figure. Think about it. That means an astonishing amount of diapers, cribs, and pediatricians, right? It fueled an entirely new domestic economy from the ground up. Suddenly, the country desperately needed millions of new homes, elementary schools, and toys. It was like an engine of consumption that completely reshaped the domestic market and totally transformed everyday American life.
And you know what drove this new consumer culture right into the living room? Television. Just look at this leap. In 1948, fewer than 200,000 homes had a TV. By 1960, 90% of households were tuning in. 90%! For the very first time, advertising was just piped directly into American homes. But it wasn't just selling products, right? It was selling the ultimate ideal of the American family. It literally changed how people ate. I mean, they invented the TV dinner just so families wouldn't miss their evening programs. Network shows like I Love Lucy offer this picture-perfect vision of white, suburban, nuclear family normalcy that powerfully reinforced the whole post-war social consensus.
Moving right along to Section 2, Designing Suburban America, the Architecture of the Boom. So how did America actually build this new middle-class dream? Where did all these millions of new families actually go? Well, the physical landscape of the United States was about to change forever. And the absolute game changer here is the GI Bill. This act offered returning veterans low-interest home loans, unemployment insurance, and college tuition subsidies. And the scale of this democratization, you really can't overstate it. Before this, going to college was a privilege reserved almost entirely for the elite. But the GI Bill flipped society on its head virtually overnight, sending almost 8 million veterans to higher education by 1956. Plus, those subsidized mortgages made homeownership a reality for the working class for the very first time.
Naturally, spreading out into all these new suburbs required a massive shift in mobility. The car became the ultimate essential technology of suburban life. Car registrations basically doubled, hitting 52 million by 1955. And this was heavily supported by the brand new $25 billion interstate highway system championed by President Eisenhower. But actually, here's a really fascinating little insight. Eisenhower pushed this massive infrastructure project primarily as a national defense mechanism. He wanted a foolproof way to evacuate major cities quickly in the event of a nuclear attack. It's one of those crazy details that perfectly ties the era's incredible economic prosperity directly to its underlying paranoia.
But here is the critical twist we have to examine. On paper, the GI Bill was written with race-neutral language, but in practice, its benefits were filtered through highly discriminatory local institutions. Developers were industrializing home building in places like Levittown, making homes super affordable. but they strictly enforced Caucasians-only leases. On top of that, federal redlining explicitly denied mortgages to black applicants, effectively trapping them in urban rentals. This system deliberately excluded black veterans from the exact home equity appreciation that was building the white middle class. And it's exactly this dynamic that laid the deeply entrenched foundation for the modern racial wealth gap we're still grappling with today.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Red Scare, the era of paranoia.
So this is where we really get into the dark underside of that 1950s consensus. Because as prosperity was just booming on the surface, this profound, pervasive political anxiety was festering right underneath. You really can't separate the economic boom from the psychological chill of the Cold War. And look, the fear gripping the nation wasn't just made up out of thin air. Look at this rapid-fire timeline. In 1948, the communist takeover of China. In 1949, the Soviet Union shocked the entire world by testing an atomic bomb years ahead of American estimates. Then came those high-profile espionage convictions. In just 5 short years, America went from feeling like this invincible post-war superpower to feeling terrified, exposed, and completely vulnerable.
And as you might guess, opportunistic figures exploited those exact anxieties, which gave rise to McCarthyism. Named after Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, this wasn't really a legal proceeding at its core, it was a political phenomenon. It completely capitalized on the genuine fear of Soviet espionage to destroy careers and silence dissent. Just try to paint a picture of this in your mind for a second. This was a time of neighbors suspecting neighbors, mandatory loyalty oaths just to hold basic jobs, like being a teacher. There was a terrifyingly effective chilling effect on free speech. It completely prioritized guilt by association over actual hard legal evidence.
The reckless sweep of these investigations was honestly astounding. It started with the House Un-American Activities Committee targeting the motion picture industry, which led to the imprisonment and blacklisting of the Hollywood 10. But McCarthy, he took it way further in the Senate. He went after State Department officials. He actually accused General George Marshall, literally the architect of World War II victory, of treason. And eventually, in this wild, dramatic overreach, a real moment of Icarus flying too close to the sun, he targeted the United States Army itself. So, the fever only broke when McCarthy's bullying tactics were finally dragged out into the light. In 1954, the Army McCarthy hearings were televised live to roughly 20 million Americans. When McCarthy aggressively attacked a young lawyer, Army attorney Joseph Welch just paused, looked right at McCarthy, and delivered this quiet, absolutely devastating rebuke. "Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last?" Wow. It instantly crystallized the national mood, exposed the cruelty of the hearings, and completely shattered McCarthy's political influence for good. All right, moving into Section 4, Voices of Dissent, featuring the Beat Generation.
So, stuck between the massive pressure to buy a suburban home and the very real fear of being labeled un-American, conformism was incredibly high. But hey, not everyone was buying into this whole consensus, which leads us to the cultural rebels of the era, the Beat Generation. This was a small, culturally potent group of writers and artists hanging out in the jazz clubs of Greenwich Village and San Francisco. They looked at those shining new appliances and the identical suburban homes and saw a society that was just repressive and spiritually empty. To really understand their wild, spontaneous energy, consider this. Jack Kerouac famously typed his defining novel, On the Road, on a single continuous 120-foot scroll of paper. Why? Just so he wouldn't have to break his creative flow to change pages. They were completely rejecting the era's materialism. And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, Seeds of the 60s, the breaking point.
As we wrap up this explainer, let's bring these two heavily conflicting realities together to see exactly how they ignited the decade that followed. Because the 1950s didn't just quietly end, it fractured. The standard view remembers rising living standards, the GI Bill democratizing education, and this grand national unity. But the dissenting, lived reality for a lot of folks was entirely different. It was suffocating conformism where women were pushed out of the workforce and back into domesticity. It was a system of legal apartheid for African Americans. It was an environment where homosexuality was criminalized, and it was the aggressive suppression of political dissent. The paradox arc, right? It was simultaneously an era of democratic prosperity and systemic exclusion.
And it was exactly this massive, hypocritical gap between that shiny, televised official image and the stifling, unequal lived reality that built the explosive pressure for the next decade. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, the campus anti-war protests, the youth counterculture, none of these just magically appeared out of nowhere in the 60s. No way. They took their direct, intense energy from the suppressed and concealed human costs of the 1950s. The pressure cooker finally blew its lid.
Which leaves us with a really critical thought for today. The 1950s teaches us that massive economic booms and deep systemic inequality can absolutely share the exact same space. So look around at our modern era. What underlying inequalities are we building our current prosperity upon? Whose struggles are being edited out of the official picture today? And when will that breaking point arrive? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those hard questions, and I'll catch you in the next one.